Hello, thank you for your interest in the draft model zoning code for affordable housing, which is open for public feedback through January 31st, 2026. So a quick overview of what I'll be talking about in this video. First, I'll be going over the timeline where we're at in the model code and some tips for viewing it. If you don't have time to watch the whole video, I definitely suggest at least viewing the first part to take a look at the tips. I'm also going to talk about what zoning is in case you're unsure or you need a refresher. I'll go over the project background and what we learned in public outreach, the different planning documents that are influencing this project, and then I'll go over the model code content section by section. It might be helpful to have the model code itself open in a different window so you can pause the video and go take a look at the different sections as needed. Then we'll wrap up. You can view the model code itself and open up the feedback form at envisiongallatin.com. Just scroll down to the model zoning code project, click learn more. The model code also has its own tab on that page. Please do reach out if you're having trouble with any of this. We'd be really happy to help you out. You can shoot us an email or call or stop by the office. So first, a quick overview of where we've been and where we're headed. We began this project in April of 2025 with stakeholder interviews and a review of existing planning documents. Then we used the information we gleaned in those interviews and from the plans to develop 2 public workshops and launch an online survey in summer of 2025. We used all that information from the public and from the initial review. Thanks so much for everyone who provided input at this stage to create the draft of the model zoning code. We then, or are now, launching that code for public feedback. And once we get all your feedback, we will use it to refine the draft and publish it. Unlike some other recent planning documents that have been adopted recently, like the future land use map, there's no formal adoption process for the model code. It is just a tool, so it will be posted on the website for use, but again, with no formal adoption process by the County Commission. Additionally, anytime you see some text that is blue and underlined, that is a link and will take you to the appropriate section in the code if you click on it. Additionally, in the left-hand corner of every page is a return to table of contents link, which will take you back to that table, and then you can click on various sections from there. Also, in the bottom right corner of every page in the body of the code is the page number. While you're going through the code, it might be helpful to take down any page numbers and section numbers that you want to comment on for when you input your feedback into the feedback form. It's really helpful if you include those so we know what section of the code you're talking about. Another tip on navigating the code, you will see these little icons placed throughout it. And those icons are meant to represent themes from the growth policy, housing strategy, and public outreach for this project. And we provided a lot of information under each icon in the appendix of the model code. But just know anytime you see these icons, they're meant to represent the theme that's next to them on the left there, to tie portions of the code to all of those documents and outreach documents to make sure that the code is fulfilling some of those goals from existing plans and public outreach. Anytime you see a capitalized term in the model code that is not at the start of a sentence, that's going to be an indication that it's a defined term, which includes a definition in the definition section. Importantly, some of the uses, like small grocery store and gas station, include square footage limitations that are in the definition section. All right, so what is zoning? In short, zoning sets the parameters for what can be built where in the county. So when we develop zoning, we always take into account things like existing plans and guiding documents, like the growth policy and any neighborhood plans. We do extensive community input and then also take into account any limitations by state law, and all of that combined together creates the content for a zoning regulation. And a zoning regulation applies to a zoning district. So that's going to be a defined geographic area in the county. And a zoning district usually contains one or more sub-districts, which contain standards that are specific to different areas to create a certain type of development pattern. So for example, in this graphic, Subdistrict 1 could be the rural residential subdistrict, and number 2 could be the local services subdistrict. In terms of content, zoning usually includes these elements. We'll talk about these terms quite a bit in the code, so I'm going to go over what they mean now. So density usually refers to the number of dwelling units that can be built on an acre or another specified unit of land. It also contains a list of permitted or allowed uses. So those are uses that can occur by right, usually without special permitting. Any permitting required could be reviewed in-house by the planning department, and sometimes permitting isn't even required at all. There's also a list of conditional uses, and those are uses that are allowed under certain circumstances. So after public notice, there is a public hearing with opportunity for verbal public comment. Folks can also write in with their comment. And then based off of any concerns that come up in public outreach or that the governing body has, they can attach additional conditions of approval to the use that place limitations that are appropriate to protect public health and safety and general welfare. Zoning also usually includes setbacks, and that's how far a building or structure can be from things like adjacent property lines, water courses, roads, etc. And while zoning does contain some elements of design, things like building height limitations, it does not contain extensive architectural standards usually. And again, public engagement is essential in the creation of a zoning regulation. Now I'll go over some background information for the model code and explain why one was needed. All of this information is in section 1 of the model code as well. In 2024, Gallatin County adopted the housing strategy, which documents the affordable housing shortage. It shows that folks earning the area median income or below are having a really hard time finding housing in the county. And in some cases, folks earning above the area median income are going to have a hard time finding housing in certain areas. We also did outreach as part of this project, which showed that the housing shortage is having significant impacts in our community. Business owners and managers noted that they're having a hard time finding and retaining employees due to lack of housing, and also individuals and families are having a hard time maintaining their social connections when people move out of town to afford housing. And the housing strategy includes several recommendations to address the shortage. It talks about zoning reform, specifically making sure that zoning includes diverse unit types allowed, and that we reduce barriers to quality affordable units and make sure that the units that we permit are inclusive of folks in different life stages, perhaps as people age and as they're starting families, etc. And it also notes that affordability includes cost of occupancy. So we can look at things like reducing energy costs and water use, for example, to help with those utility bills. It also recommends a voluntary incentive program. So that is where zoning offers relaxations from certain standards in exchange for affordable units in a development. And this is in the model code, so we'll talk more about it later, but I will talk about elements of the incentive program as we go through the code, so it's important to have a basic understanding of what that is. And the strategy also recommends that we monitor and regulate short-term rentals. That's things like VRBO and Airbnb. The code also includes some standards for short-term rentals. The model code is also intended to fill some knowledge gaps, and we have sort of a wish list for it. While the county has a lot of experience with administering zoning code in more rural areas, we don't have as much experience or examples of zoning code for more urbanizing areas or where there's a lot of growth and development pressure, or for our small community cores. We need this project to be compatible with the discussion that the County Commission is having about zoning reform in general. So that is a separate project from this one, and there is a tab on the Envision Gallatin website that talks all about zoning reform if you're interested. But basically, the County Commission is looking at potentially reforming or creating new zoning in the growth area of the county, and so this project needs to be able to plug into that one based off of whatever the Commission decides to do. And so that's why it's a code of example standards and not a firm zoning proposal for a particular area. The model code also needs to be useful over the long term. A lot of effort has gone into this project, and a lot of the public has dedicated their time to giving feedback, so we want to make sure that it includes standards that could be useful over many years, not necessarily in this one moment in time. We also need the code to consider transportation options that we have in the county and lack thereof, as well as lack of infrastructure. That's a huge topic, a huge part of the model code that I'll bring up continually in the remainder of the presentation. The model code also needs to incorporate the goals of the growth policy and the future land use map, which was recently adopted. All right, so what did we learn in public outreach for the model code? So as I mentioned earlier, we began the project with stakeholder interviews to set the stage. We talked to folks like builders and real estate professionals, housing nonprofit professionals, etc. If you're interested in learning more about the stakeholder interviews, this summary is available on the project website. And the interviewees talked about many barriers to housing affordability. The high costs of land and labor and building materials can make it difficult to list units at affordable price. Sometimes restrictive zoning standards can also make it hard to price units affordably. Long permit review times can drag out the zoning and subdivision review process and make it so that costs are kind of accrued throughout the process. As they noted, time is money. They also pointed to some restrictions in state law that can make it difficult to build affordable units, which includes the ban on inclusionary zoning and some limitations placed on impact fees that can make it hard for local governments to build out infrastructure appropriately. The interviewees also talked about the infrastructure and transportation limitations in the county and how that can make it difficult to build affordable housing in general and also in locations that are connected to employment opportunities and services. The interviewees also recommended some densities and some design standards and lack thereof that could be helpful to include in the model code, and we took that into account while creating the draft. They talked about STRs as a tool for affordability, also noting that sometimes they can decrease affordability when they monopolize an area, but when folks can rent out a bedroom in their unit or rent out their unit when they're away, they can help that household afford their home. And because public outreach was centered in Four Corners and Gallatin Gateway, the stakeholder interviewees also offered some context about those areas. And the project team used what we learned from the interviewees to create the content for 2 drop-in workshops that were held in Four Corners and Gallatin Gateway. And we chose those locations for outreach because folks in those areas have noted that they're experiencing a lot of development pressure, and also there's been some appetite for a new zoning regulation. We also offered an online survey to folks that was open for 6 weeks and helped us glean more information about what folks want to see in terms of a model code for affordable housing. And in the workshops and in the survey, folks noted a significant concern about infrastructure and transportation limitations in the county, just like our interviewees did. The folks in Gallatin Gateway in particular are really concerned about becoming a bedroom community for Big Sky. They expressed significant concerns over new housing in Gallatin Gateway, increasing traffic along 191 as folks commute to Big Sky and elsewhere. A few even noted some horrific traffic accidents that they had personally witnessed. Folks also noted water and sewer district limitations, as well as lack of capacity of the school to accommodate new students. Like the interviewees, the drop-in workshops and survey participants also expressed support for smaller homes, things like cottage housing, and the ability to convert an existing dwelling unit into a multi-dwelling unit. They also expressed support for community amenities, things like trails and open space, sports courts, soccer fields, etc. Some also talked about accessory dwelling units. So if you're not familiar, an accessory dwelling unit or an ADU is a smaller unit, usually on the same lot as a larger single dwelling unit or attached within a single dwelling unit. And because it tends to be smaller, they can be a little bit more affordable. And some participants expressed support for reducing barriers to building ADUs. In some cases, they require a public hearing, so they suggested taking that away and overall just making it easier to build ADUs. There was also support expressed for mixed-use developments. That's when you have commercial and residential combined in the same building, and also live-work developments, particularly in Four Corners. And there was a lot more said in public outreach. Again, this summary is available on the project website if you'd like to take a look, and we're deeply grateful to all who provided input during public outreach. All of it informed what is in the model code. Okay, so before we keep going, just a quick recap on what the model code is and what it's not. So it's a tool, it's example standards, it's not a zoning proposal for a specific area. It's not meant to say affordable housing goes in this particular place. It's meant to say for the housing that's built, how do we give that housing a chance to be more affordable? How do we make sure that zoning stays out of the way of affordable housing? If someone's got a really cool creative idea for an affordable housing development, how do we make sure that zoning is not preventing that? The model code also takes into account the varying infrastructure conditions in the county. As I just went over in depth, folks are really concerned about this. Very appropriately, it is not a good idea to promote housing in places that do not have the infrastructure to support it. So that is a key part of the code that I'll talk about more in depth throughout the presentation. Some jurisdictions are using an increased density approach to increase affordable housing. So the hope there is that by providing allowances for more units in a given area, those units will come down in price and be more affordable for folks. A high density or increased density approach is appropriate in some areas that, again, have the infrastructure to support that development, but the county does not have robust infrastructure in all areas, so therefore we do not use a high density only approach in this code. The document includes many mechanisms to increase affordability beyond just looking at density. Also, the model code is limited to housing. There are some really important standards to protect things like agriculture and water quality that are in most of our zoning codes that aren't in this one, and that's because this model code is directly aimed at affordable housing. So if any standards from the code were input into new zoning or an existing zoning code, we would want to take a look at that time and make sure that all other important standards are included. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at the model code. You're looking at a code mostly for housing. Although some of the standards do benefit things like agriculture and water quality as represented by our icons that I went over earlier. So those are ancillary benefits, but it's not necessarily the main goal of this code to protect those things outright. So just a note there. Now we'll dive into the model code content. So what is affordable housing? The housing strategy talks about how housing is considered affordable when it takes up no more than 30% of a household's gross income. And one type of affordable housing is attainable housing, which is naturally occurring without a formal mechanism to restrict the price. And to promote this type of housing, the model code promotes a variety of unit types allowed by right, and also doesn't place any limitations like minimum width standards or roof pitch requirements to prevent manufactured homes. It permits a variety of small lot sizes, and there's also no minimum square footage for dwelling units to allow for smaller units and things like tiny homes. ADUs are also permitted across all recommended subdistricts with no special hearing process required. The code also allows for owner-occupied short-term rentals in a more permissive way than non-owner-occupied short-term rentals, and that's to address the interviewee's suggestion that short-term rentals, when the owner lives there, can be used as a tool for affordability. And there's also capital A affordable housing, and that is housing that includes a deed or covenant restriction to ensure that it remains affordable over time. And to address that, we include the voluntary incentive program. I've mentioned several times the model code takes into account the varying infrastructure conditions that exist in the county. And it does that by tying the recommended standards to the various future land use map or FLUME categories. So if you're not familiar, the FLUME was adopted as part of the growth policy in 2024. In short, it's a visual representation of the goals and policies of the growth policy. It shows where development is more and less suitable in a map form. So to create the FLUME, we first did a development suitability analysis that looked at where our existing community cores are with infrastructure and services, where the water and sewer districts are, wildlife habitat, wildfire risk, steep slopes, floodplain, where the water courses are, and where public lands are, to create these different FLUME categories. So the model code only uses the first 4 of the FLUME categories listed here, so those are the ones I'll focus on. So urban growth areas have a water and sewer district and existing services, and these are identified by the FLUME as most appropriate for development. Rural growth areas, on the other hand, are in some ways similar to urban growth areas, but their water and sewer districts provide water or sewer services, but not both. Therefore, development recommendations are a little bit more limited in rural growth areas. Public infrastructure holding areas have some similar attributes to rural and urban growth areas. However, they are part of a water and sewer district planning area, but are not currently annexed into the district. Therefore, it's recommended that lots in the PIHA remain in existing configurations until those services are extended. So low density are recommended there, and to reflect that, low densities are recommended in the model code. Also, in terms of the range of permitted uses that are allowed in the code, less are allowed in the or promoted in the PIHA because of that lack of infrastructure. Managed growth areas are not part of a water and sewer district, nor are they planned to be, and contain more development constraints than the first three. Therefore, low densities are recommended there in the future land use map, and again, that's reflected in the model code as well. And that's to prevent sprawl and the proliferation of development not on services. And the model code includes 5 example subdistricts that are tied to the various flume categories. We'll see some charts that demonstrate what that looks like, but first I'll go over what the 5 example subdistricts would be like if developed. So the community business subdistrict is meant to be kind of a lively, walkable, Main Street type development. A wide variety of commercial uses are permitted here, and residential units on upper stories of commercial development are encouraged. Mixed-use residential is similar, however, there's a bit more of an emphasis on residential development here. These are still promoting a walkable neighborhood with a variety of services to support residential development. Residential A includes a wide variety of housing options with some neighborhood amenities, again, to support that residential development, but less emphasis on commercial than the first two. Residential B bridges the gap between the first 3 subdistricts that I've gone over and residential C, which I'll talk about in a moment. A wide range of housing types are encouraged here, but again, lesser emphasis on commercial services than even the first 3. And then residential C is meant to be in our areas where there's significant lack of infrastructure and services. So development density and intensity are set lower for residential C to reflect this. Okay, so now how are the future land use map categories and the subdistricts tied together? So you'll see throughout the model code some charts that will tie the subdistrict name. So in this example, we've got the community business subdistrict to the different future land use map categories. So anytime you see community business subdistrict and, for example, urban growth area below, you'll know that the following standards apply to the community business subdistrict in the urban growth areas. But just because we've got the community business subdistrict heading, that doesn't mean that the same level of density and intensity is appropriate across these 4 future land use map categories. So the model code includes standards that reflect the varying infrastructure levels in each of these future land use map categories. So I think this will make more sense as we go on. It also might be helpful for you to open up the future land use map that's on envisiongallatin.com and the planning website and have that open as you're going through the model codes so you can see what it might look like or where these different standards might apply based off of the future land use map categories. Okay, so moving on to section 2. In this section, we've got the development and design standards. So there's limitations on height and setbacks. We've also got a parking standard of 1 stall or space per dwelling unit. And importantly, that is just a minimum. A developer could certainly provide much more parking than that if it was appropriate for the area or that development. We've also got lighting requirements to preserve dark skies. That's something we've heard a lot about in public feedback that folks want to see to prevent neighborhood disruption, to prevent light pollution, and also to protect wildlife. And in this section, we've got a list of all our different unit types. 2 of them that you may not have heard before are cottage housing and courtyard developments. So cottage housing looks like the image on the right. You have a group of typically smaller units that tend to be more affordable, that share and open space sites. So the requirement in the model code is a 25% open space dedication. This type of development was really popular in public outreach, so we wanted to make sure that we allowed for cottage housing and included some standards for that. And then courtyard apartments, so that's an apartment building that's got a courtyard in the middle that kind of promotes that open space and the shared amenities for folks that might live in that apartment building. So we made sure to include those as well, as that was another popular type of building. So here's a residential use table. So you'll see we've got the 5 different sub-districts at the top and then the future land use map category abbreviations below so that we can match the sub-districts to the infrastructure and development constraints as described in the future land use map. And in this table, an A stands for allowed and a C stands for conditional use. So remember, allowed is allowed by right with any in-house permitting that's required, and then a conditional use requires a public hearing. And then on the left there, you've got the different types of dwelling units. And so you can look at, for example, if you're interested in the residential C subdistrict, what's allowed in the rural growth areas there, and then you can look down the list and see, okay, accessory dwelling units are allowed, as are single dwelling units, cottage housing, courtyard apartments are conditional, so those require a public hearing, and then community facilities are allowed as well. So community facilities, those are going to be your things like parks, sports courts, little gyms, etc., that serve a development or more than one developments. And then we've got our non-residential use table. This table is much bigger than what I can show on the slide here, so suggest taking a look if you're interested in that. It functions much the same way as the residential use table, but it's got a little bit more in terms of conditional uses to make sure that we're accounting for the different impacts that these different commercial uses might have on communities. There's also things like daycare accounted for, daycare at home or a daycare center, to make sure that we're allowing for those for folks to help out with childcare. There's also a small grocery store listed here in order to promote access to food. Many folks were concerned about lack of grocery stores in the county, so you'll notice that one is allowed across the board in any subdistrict in any future land use map category. And again, the definition of small grocery store includes a square footage limitation. So here's the density table that's shown in the model code, and it ties the future land use map categories and the example subdistricts together to account for infrastructure conditions. So the number shown outside of the parentheses is the max density available in that subdistrict without utilizing the affordable housing incentives. And for developments that do use those incentives, they can access the density that is shown in parentheses. So in urban growth areas in the community business subdistrict, a maximum of 15 dwelling units per acre is recommended, and up to 25 when using the affordable housing incentives and providing affordable housing. Densities are set the highest in the urban growth areas because they have the most infrastructure availability, and then a bit lower in the rural growth areas to account for lesser infrastructure. But again, if you look from the community business subdistrict to the residential C subdistrict, you'll note that there are varying densities recommended there. And again, that's to tie it to infrastructure and the varying development patterns that might be seen in the county. Public infrastructure holding area and managed growth area densities are set lower to reflect lack of services at 1 unit per 40 acres in the PIHA, and then the same in the MGA with a density bonus of up to 1 unit per 20 acres if providing affordable housing. So there are 4 subdistricts and corresponding flume categories you'll notice are in gray, and so those subdistricts are not recommended in those flume categories to promote efficient use of infrastructure and to prevent sprawl. So in the UGAs, residential C is not appropriate because there's more infrastructure and service availability in those areas. Those kind of larger lots, lower density is not recommended in UGAs. RGAs have residential C, on the other hand, because there can be less infrastructure in those areas. And then residential A and B are not recommended in PIHA and MGA to prevent sprawl and development on lack of services. Importantly, the densities in the UGA and the RGA, for the most part, are going to require connection to a water and sewer district, and a developer must show how they're providing water and sewer services and protecting public health and safety in that development through the subdivision or buildings by lease or rent review process. So remember, zoning sets the parameters for development. It is not a guarantee of any development type. In order to achieve this level of development shown in the green box there, you would need to go through either subdivision or BLR review. Zoning would not guarantee you that density by right without a further review process. And here is the base and bonus height by, again, subdistrict and future land use map category. It works exactly the same way as the previous table does, again, with the same subdistricts in gray to show that they're not available in the corresponding future land use map categories. In the community business subdistrict, the base height is 45 feet, a bonus height is 65 feet, and the height is the same for all other subdistricts and future land use map categories. And this is a recommendation again, and this is also a draft, so we'd love to hear any feedback if folks have it on this table or anything else in the model code. Model code also includes minimum density recommendations to discourage sprawl and promote efficient use of taxpayer resources and infrastructure. So when you have a number of units spread across a large area, that can be very expensive for local government to serve. And when you do have infrastructure, it's important that that is utilized efficiently to use taxpayer resources the best that we can. So that's why there is a minimum density in the urban and rural growth areas in the first 4 subdistricts. However, there is no minimum density recommended in the RGA, in residential C, or in any PIHA or MGA flume category. And that's because there is less infrastructure available in those areas typically, and we want to make sure that we're not promoting development that is not on centralized services. Short-term rentals. So the model code includes short-term rental standards to support affordability, of course, and also to protect public health and safety. And it distinguishes between owner-occupied and non-owner-occupied STRs. So owner-occupied is exactly what it sounds like. The unit is occupied by the owner. It's their verified primary residence, and they'll have to submit that verification to the planning department if the standards were put into effect. And they can rent a bedroom in the unit, or they can rent a unit on the property. So they can rent out the ADU while they live in a single dwelling unit, or vice versa, but they can't rent out both independently of one another. Non-owner occupied is where the owner does not maintain their primary residence on the property. They live elsewhere. So they visit the unit maybe a handful of weeks out of the year, and it's a vacation property, or maybe they don't visit at all. It's a full-time short-term rental. Overall, the use tables in the model code in the non-residential section are much more permissive with the owner-occupied short-term rental type and much less so with the non-owner-occupied short-term rental type. There are more health and safety standards for short-term rentals in Section 2.6, including standards that ensure that the owners get any applicable Gallatin City County Health Department licensing, and there's also a requirement that they make available a Gallatin County information sheet to their guests that explains things like recreating and driving in agricultural areas, wildlife safety, bear safety, and driving in winter conditions. So check that out. So we do have 3 graphics in the model code to show you what the 5 subdistricts would look like in urban, rural, and managed growth areas if developed. These are going to be a little hard to see on my screen here, so I suggest opening up the model code and taking a look at them there. Some tips for viewing: the units that are outlined in yellow and have the yellow number in front of them, those ones are developments that utilize the affordable housing incentives, and which incentives are used are shown in the second box on the bottom there underneath each subdistrict. Otherwise, the numbers correspond to the number below, and that tells you what that unit or development type is meant to represent. Each subdistrict here is an acre. And importantly, this is not an exact example of how these subdistricts might develop. This is just an example for you. Different sites have varying constraints, and neighborhoods have different needs. There's also different market conditions that come into play here as well. So this is just an example for you about what these subdistricts might look like to kind of bring it to life, but it's definitely not a guarantee that if any of these subdistricts were adopted that it would look exactly this way in the county. Also, I'll just point out the buffer zone in the mixed-use residential subdistrict. That's a landscape buffer that is required by Section 5 of the code, so you can take a look at when that's required. It's basically meant to help screen and buffer uses of varying intensities from one another to increase quality of life. And here is a very similar graphic, but for the rural growth area subdistricts. So it functions very much the same way, with the yellow units using the incentives and the ones that are not in yellow not using the incentives. But we've got all 5 subdistricts here. Unlike the urban growth areas, the rural growth includes residential C as a reflection of the lack of infrastructure that can exist in the rural growth areas. And then we've got the managed growth area example subdistrict graphic. So this one is different than the previous two because low densities are recommended here. Each subdistrict shown is an acre, but if you look at the upper part of this graphic, it continues on. The arrows show that each subdistrict continues on in increments of 20 or 40 acres. So just keep in mind, try and visualize the development type shown here being on 1 acre of a larger 20 or 40 acre parcel, but otherwise it reads the same way as the other 2 graphics. On to section 3. This section talks all about the voluntary incentive program. So remember, there are relaxations from certain design standards in the zoning code for affordable housing developments. And this requires, in order to access those incentives, developers must provide at least 10% of the units in their development as affordable. And they must restrict them for units that will be rented to 60% area median income or less, and for units that will be owned 120% of AMI or less. And this chart on the right, again, might be a little bit hard to see, but there is a bigger version on the project website, shows the different occupations that folks in the various AMI brackets might have. So in the 30 to 60% AMI category, those might be folks that are certified nursing aides or CNAs, detention officers, teachers, etc. So this just kind of helps illustrate what it means to earn the area median income and what kind of occupation you might have. And this is just examples. So take a look there to understand more about AMI. Okay, so we talked about the density bonus, we talked about the height increase. The other 2 optional incentives as part of the voluntary incentive program are a no parking minimum and no setbacks. But there's 2 very important caveats with both of those. So if a developer is going to provide less than 1 parking stall or space per unit, they need to demonstrate how folks in that development are going to get around without a personal vehicle. So they need to show that there's robust trails nearby that lead to services and employment opportunities. They need to show how there's a bus, or that they're implementing a rideshare program, etc. Currently, there are probably no or very few areas of the county where a developer could demonstrate that less than 1 parking space per unit is appropriate. But again, the code is meant to be useful over the long term. So maybe in the next 5 years or so, we have a lot more bus and trail infrastructure, and this is a more appropriate standard in some areas of the county. So that's why it's included in the model code. And then another caveat on the no setbacks, that is all setbacks except for the one that garages must be 20 feet from the edge of the access easement, if not accessed from an alley. So that's to promote walkable streetscapes and kind of prevent vehicle pedestrian conflict. Section 4. Planned unit developments. So this is a type of development that's reviewed through the conditional use permit process. So you'll remember that requires a public hearing. And the intent of PUDs is to offer relaxations from certain development standards, things like height and setbacks, to promote creative development designs. But unlike the affordable housing incentive requirements, it's not directly tied to affordability. A developer could certainly include affordable housing here, and that's one of the things on the list of public benefits that they are required to show. That's one they could incorporate to show public benefit, but it's not strictly required in every PUD. In PUDs, developers must include at least 2 different residential unit types, 30% open space, and again, they must pick from a list of several criteria to show how they're meeting public benefit. You can view that criteria in the PUD section. So the image on the right shows how a PUD might possibly develop under this regulation. This is just an example. So in the housing portion, to show that they're providing public benefit, the developer might include 2 affordable housing units there. And then in their open space, they might include a community garden to show how they're contributing to local food systems. And then in the southern portion there, they could provide a grocery store, daycare, and a little cafe to support those residential uses. And this creates a walkable community. Folks that live in the houses there would have access to their food and their daycare very nearby, which again decreases traffic and commuting. Section 5, this is the last section we'll talk about. So this includes the landscaping requirements, and it's got standards for street trees and public frontages. This increases quality of life, reduces heat, and it has positive impacts on the environment. There's some standards for parking lot landscape to ensure shade. There are screening and buffering requirements. We saw what that might look like earlier in the graphic examples of the sub-districts, and that's to help separate uses of varying intensities. There's also some water conservation standards, and that helps with preservation of water quantity as well as reducing occupancy costs if folks have to pay less for their water bill. There's also some tree preservation and maintenance standards, and there are some defensible space standards for our areas in the managed growth that might have higher fire risk to help protect folks from fire. Okay, thank you so much for listening to this video. Really appreciate it. So once again, how to give feedback, please review the draft of the model code on envisiongallatin.com and then go to the form that's linked there and input your feedback. We would really appreciate that. It would help us make this code the best that it can be. Again, if you're struggling with any of the content in the model code, you're not understanding certain sections, you're having trouble with technology, please do reach out. We would be really happy to help you. Shoot us an email, give us a phone call, or stop by in person, whatever works for you. You can also mail your feedback to us if you'd like to do that as well. You can send it to this address. And finally, there are many ways to keep in touch with your local government. So you can follow the county on social media, you can sign up for the bulletin, and you can check the Bozeman Daily Chronicle legal notices. Thanks again, really appreciate your time. Have a great day.